today we're uncovering the world of Bollywood with the author Sunny Singh. In this episode, we dive into her personal journey and the captivating history and vibrant culture of Indian cinema. If you're curious about how Bollywood shapes narratives and influences global popular culture, or if you're just looking for a fresh perspective on your favourite films, you won't want to miss this. And don't miss the end for a sneak peek at what's coming up in the next few weeks.
Well, hello, I am Sunny Singh. I am an academic and author, also the director of the Chalak Prize and various other literary and literacy initiatives.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I've been following you on Twitter for God knows how many years now, and I had the fortune actually to get a preview copy of your book, which I have thoroughly enjoyed, and it's been quite interesting because I have to admit I'm not a massive fan of Bollywood. And I didn't know quite what to expect, but the book was really engaging in a very surprising way, in that it's part biography and it's obviously about yourself and about you growing up, but it's equally about a really critical view of Bollywood movies and breaking them down into all these various aspects, which I just would never have even thought of or known of, let alone anything else. And I think what was really good by the end of the book is that my Western diaspora view of Bollywood had been completely turned on its head. I had a very much like Bollywood is almost like a B-grade version of Hollywood. It's almost like it's a secondary version of the original, whereas actually I think what you did and what I really took from it was how all those different facets of a good story, a good narrative, are deeply embedded in Indian aesthetic. I just don't want to start kind of from the beginning, which is, could you tell us more about yourself, your family history, your background, and how that shaped you? Because obviously as we go through the book, you are all over the globe, which was really enjoyable too, because you go from parts of India, as your father's moving around the world because of his job, you're moving with him, and then you're ending up in South America as a student, and that was the bit that I really enjoyed, because I was like, oh, I actually want to go to South America now. But yeah, you had an absolutely, from my point of view, it was an amazing life and traveling and going all over the globe, but surely that gave you a really holistic or more of a broader view of the world?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me here. And yes, I think a lot of what you've just said really resonates with me, partly because it's the kind of conversations I always have about movies from India. And there's a kind of embarrassment, not just in the diaspora, but when I'm in India, and you have the sort of the very posh English language educated, that kind of elite, and they look down on their nose. And I think Karan Johar has talked about his sort of a guilty pleasure, where this is a man who was from sort of basically movie royalty, and yet felt that he had to hide his love for the cinema. So I think some part of it was, for my book, was very much rooted in saying that, we can't keep replicating these colonial patterns and narratives and the ways we think of ourselves. Indian cinema, just like whether it's Nigerian cinema or Mexican cinema or Argentinian, keep going, around the world, is very clearly rooted in the culture and its ideas and its histories, wherever it's made. And to kind of constantly use a Western lens to not only understand that cinema or watch that cinema or talk about the cinema, but also to judge that cinema, is a colonial act. Because what you're doing is you're saying, well, this is Hollywood or French cinema or Italian or German, and this is good because it's Western and it's European or white mostly. And then there is the other stuff. And that's a deeply problematic space. And we can apply this to, classic Hong Kong cinema or Korean cinema or Chinese. It's a constant ongoing process. And when we do start thinking of it, then it's this kind of, or talking about it, then it's somehow exotic. Right? So I think there's a problem. And I think for me, it's part of one of the things I'm very involved with is the idea of decolonization. But not just decolonization in a political way, but narratively, in our imaginations, we must learn to decolonize ourselves. And so for me, that starts with how we produce culture, but also how we consume culture, how we think about culture, how we talk about culture. So I think a lot of this is built in. And this takes me to the second part of your question, which was about me.
Yes.
And I think a lot of what I talk about in the book is of my history. It's quite funny because I think it's more about my family and my background rather than necessarily, writers don't live very exciting lives, frankly. So I think, but what I wanted to think about was how, if this culture is producing these movies now going for 120 years, almost 115 years, it's coming from people. So I used my personal and familial history as a kind of way of approaching Indian history of the last 150 years. And then looking at how the culture has reflected what was happening in India. And by India, I do mean that, this is, yes, after 47, we're talking about the nation state of India. But prior to that, because I start from middle of the 19th century, we're talking about the full region that we consider South Asia. And so my family is from the north of India. We're from UP and Bihar, kind of the wider extended family. In 1857, various parts of my family lineage, however you want to phrase it, and our regions were very involved with what the British call the mutiny, what we call the revolt, what Indian history and many historians call the First War of Independence. So even we can't even agree on the terms, right? And one of the things that I was very aware of from the time I was born was how deeply impoverished and oppressed the region was. And I took it for granted, as you do, because you're a child. And then as I started growing up and I started learning about history, I realized how much of it had been deliberate policy after 1860 and after the war is lost. And then slowly I started learning, of course, in my own studies of things like, Section 377, which is a Victorian law outlawing homosexuality, which is tested out in India and then rolled out elsewhere and then brought back to UK. But numerous things. And I wanted to think about what else was happening. Now, I was very fortunate because I had a grandmother and I had loads of people who had been actively involved with the nationalist movement, who had these memories, who could talk about what life was like pre-47. What they had very clear stances on colonization. And I was also very fortunate because I was born I was being raised in the 70s. And this is kind of a generation after my parents come of age. So my parents are both sort of very much the midnight children. They're born in the 40s. And that's how they grow up in an independent India. But they grow up very clearly with clear memories, if not immediate childhood interaction with the colonizer. But by the time I came around, India was part of the non-aligned movement. It was, the Cold War was on. The world was very clearly divided into, the Soviets and the Americans and their allies, the West versus everybody else. Long-standing division, that. But what was really great was my father's job and India's position meant we were constantly being exposed to people from South Africa, from Namibia, from various parts of the world. who were from what, had then been established as Bangladesh, all these people from various parts of the world who would kind of come through our dining room because of my dad's job. And it was a really wonderful way of meeting the world, because there was this commitment to liberation in different ways and different stages. So I think a lot of my personal politics and my view of the world comes from that. And I think that also filters very much into the book, because when movies take off in India, it's quite explicitly an anti-colonial idea that we can do stuff. We not we need to make our own movies. I mean, Dada Saheb Phalke, the great-great-grandfather of Indian cinema, who makes the first feature film, goes and watches the life of Jesus Christ and comes out and says, we need to make our own movies. We can't let this continue. We have to put our stories. Tagore and various other people of the same time are very clear that, when you've got 4% literacy, how are you going to reach people? You need to get the stories to them. And stories form us, right? Stories form not just our ideas, but our politics, our communities. So how are you going to tell people that, we need to organize, we need to be free? And I think movies become this really amazing space. So that, I think, is very much where my journey into cinema, but also history and myself, I guess, started and continues.
And then what led to you wanting to write this book? Because obviously I think it's quite clear from what you were just saying. Like, it seems like there was a natural kind of coming together of various things. Like, you're growing up in India in a particular time period. These movies are coming out and making huge impacts, not just in a movie sense, but also in terms of it's a post-colonial age. There's all sorts of kind of implications with what's happening. What made you then think, I want to write this book? Because what I find really interesting and also enjoyable about the book is it's not a terse textbook. It's not like you're reading something that is like, you read a couple of pages and you're like, God, you know what? I need a few days to understand what's happened. Kind of, you read a couple of chapters and you've actually gone from one part of the world to another part of the world. But on the way, you've learned about some aspect of Indian classical story making and the different races involved and the different influences and all the rest of it. What led to you going, you know what, I'm putting pen to paper and this is my objective?
Yeah. Stupid amounts of ambition.
Well, I'm glad, because I've enjoyed it. Yeah.
That would be the shortest answer. But no, more seriously, I think at some point already in my 20s, I realized that I'd been moving around the world, first because of my father's job, then because of my own work and studies and so on. And what was really interesting for me is that whenever we moved, whenever I would travel or we lived in a different country, there was a group of people who were generally not just Indian or South Asian, but generally from the global South, who knew the films, who loved the films, who were really, really keen on talking about it, because that was the shared cultural heritage across this vast land. And I think what was really interesting for me was that I would go to fairly, this is one point when I talk about being in Mexico early 20s and traveling in a really remote part of the country. I was helping a friend with their research and anyway, so long, complicated story. Land there. And we ended up talking about Mother India with a woman who had barely left her village and had gone to Mexico City like once in her life and had watched Mother India. I mean, it was extraordinary. Right? And, so this was this constant sense of why does it matter? One of the things that, always strikes me is that when in Palestine, the first Intifada, some of the places the Israelis destroyed, were the movie theaters. They bombed one of the major movie theaters, one of the classic modernist movie theaters from decades ago. They bombed the screen wall. And Indian cinema was very key to the consumption of cinema in Palestine. I had this really interesting conversation. It was one of the things that I will always regret with Rafat Al-Araid, the scholar and poet who was killed in December. We talked about our favorite movies, classic things that you do on Twitter. Yeah. And I've been wanting to do another book. And he said, he started talking about how much he loved American Anthony. And
it's a good movie.
How much, Amitabh Bachchan and his movies had played, sort of were part of the imagination for him and his friends during the first Intifada. And I was like, okay, you need to write this paper. And he was like, yeah. I'd love to write this paper. And of course, life gets in the way, and sometimes genocides get in the way.
Yeah.
So that never happened. But it's something to constantly think about, that this matters. But then I remember being in university, and I remember being in film clubs and these conferences, and people would sort of, they want to talk about Satyajit Ray. They don't want to talk about the stuff that people are watching and loving and, absolutely obsessed by. And I would say, well, yes. And then they say the same kind of thing that you said, this kind of B-grade stuff, the escapist fare for the illiterate, impoverished, starving masses who they present them this kind of fabulous lifestyle as a kind of pill, as if the people who are deprived don't know that, that they're watching something that is, it's a really condescending way of thinking about it. I mean, imagine if we actually said, people when they go watch Hollywood and they're watching these flashy, Great Gatsby or Titanic or take your pick, these poor people were just, who don't know any better. What? Right? I mean, I'm sure people who are impoverished in the West and are deprived and deeply deprived in the West can watch the movies and like Titanic, and we don't dismiss them the same way. And so that was part of what I started to do. And then, of course, it was like, okay, obviously, I've been reading this stuff. I did my PhD on precisely commercial cinema and way back in the early 2000s. So it's years, and I've been doing this for good 2 decades. And I kept going, why aren't more people talking about it? We should be talking about it. Not just kind of piecemeal, but we need a history that, not just of history of cinema in India, which kind of goes, well, this happened and this happened and this happened, but something that connects it to what else is happening in India as in its history. And in a critical way, because, the cinema is, it starts with anti-colonialism. It, after 47, becomes a kind of nation-building mythology space. It is in that sense, it has a hegemonic streak. And it walks this really strange sort of wire where it's trying to do all these different things politically. And we should make space for that, right? It shouldn't be just like, oh, this is conservative, because there's a lot of things happening. So I wanted to write that. And then it really struck me as I started to pull this book together that actually what we don't say, yes, I'm an academic, but I came to this cinema as a fan first. I refuse to be apologetic about loving the cinema. I refuse to hide the fact that I grew up on the cinema, that it shaped me. It shapes my aesthetics. It shapes my politics. It informs the way I think about the world. We cannot pretend. you would never expect somebody French to be apologetic about their cinema and their love for French cinema. Why should I?
I heard there's so much that I want to ask you off the back of that, but I will wait as we go through this. I think one of the reviews that I was reading for the book was that it describes it as offering a multi-track narrative similar to how Bollywood movies are constructed, which I think is actually the best way of describing it, because the book is just so well woven with all the different parts, and I think that's what I actually really enjoyed, because it actually was mainly like having a conversation with someone who's telling you about their day, but then also telling you about something that they know really deeply and really well. And it's clear your love and kind of just passion for movies and cinema in general comes through. I learned a hell of a lot, and it also made me think about how I could apply that to actually creating YouTube videos and creating stories and narratives, because it is just that insightful. But how did you, from a writer's perspective, go about weaving all of that together? Because it's not exactly like light work. It's not exactly like you're talking about, I don't know, like going for a walk down to the park or whatever. It's quite engaging and complex.
Thank you. Well, two things. One, I don't like books, and I'm an academic, so I read a lot of books that are heavy and serious and cover big topics. And I've always had this feeling that if we said the same stuff in clearer ways, without this kind of big hat of like, oh, I am now saying good, important things, more people would read it, more people would think about it, but people would be interested in it. I think a lot of people, and I know it used to happen to me. Where I'd just be like, oh my God, this is too, I can read 2 pages and I'm going to have to just really push myself to do this. And I think I want to write stuff that more people read, because I think kind of like Bollywood, right? You can address complicated ideas. You can address big issues while also having fun.
Yeah.
Right? So it shouldn't be, because I think that division of somehow serious being, worthy, and then something, that is fun and superficial is a really false one. So that was the first thing. I wanted a book that I would have wanted to read. And I would still want to read. I wanted a book that somebody who just loves cinema and loves Bollywood would just pick it up and say, "Yay, this is such fun!" And they could just read it, and they could focus on the important stuff, or they could open, just focus on the anecdotes, or they could focus on the trivia, or they could focus on the politics or the aesthetics or the philosophy, and they could just kind of dip into it and take away, and then maybe down the line they'd say, "Hey, I remember that," and come back. And so that's what I wanted to do. But that way of storytelling is thanks to Bollywood. It's thanks to people like Raj Kapoor and Dev Anand, and I'm now talking of them as directors, not as actors, Guru Dutt, but also people like Yash Chopra, Yash Johar, and Nasir Hussain, and Farah Khan, and of course the greatest of them all, Manmohan Desai. And these are people who could take really big things, big topics, and they would weave it into a movie that you could go see with your friends. You could take your mom, you could go see with your family, you could go see on a date, you could go, and you could do it various times, and you would get different things out of it. Because what they did, and that kind of goes back to the logic of, aesthetic theory, and but more than that, performance in India, all kinds of performance, not just kind of high Sanskrit theatre performance, but all forms of performance, which don't shy away from mixing serious with the unserious or comedic. They don't shy away from big themes and big emotions and really hard things, tragedy and horror, but with love and romance, and so I wanted that because that's the way I learned how to tell stories, and one of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that I grew up in Varanasi. So
Yeah.
a large part of my early childhood till I was about 11 was spent there. Varanasi is a really, it's a vibrant, ancient city. And we grew up with cinema, but we grew up also with Western cinema that we would see mostly to learn English and practice English. But, and I frankly found the whole single track. I found it initially baffling that somebody would structure that kind of 3-act logic of like things happen and then this happens. And it was just really strange. But also, Varanasi has one of the UNESCO recognized performances of the Ramayana, which happens every year. But what is also amazing to me, and I learned that as a kid, was that we would go to specific areas, but there are lots of parts of the city that for those 10 days stop existing on the geographical, physical plane and become this kind of mythical space where the stuff happens. And the rest of the time, so my school bus used to go through a place called Lanka, which is technically, is where it's right in front of the university, and my favorite movie theater was there. But that's actually the Lanka, it's named after the Lanka of the Ramayana. And the battle would happen there. And it would suddenly, you had this incredible performance that would suddenly take over. And I think what really I never understood, and then there would be classical theater and dance performance and the Shankar Institute, so we would go there, and all of these things kind of would mingle into each other.
Yeah.
Because I was like, well, I can see how these are the same ways of telling the story. They're telling stories as folk theater or as cinema or Bharatanatyam performance or, a classical music performance, but the structures were constantly recognizable. And so I could understand that even that as a kid. And it really struck me that, it's a great way to tell the story because that meant that the kid can pick it up, but also somebody who wants to do it more seriously.
Yeah.
So really, that's what I brought to the book and structuring the book. And I think that is very much part of that wider structural theoretical framework that I also talk about in the book.
It really works. I know I keep going on about it, and I'm not just saying it because you're on the podcast, but genuinely it really works because it kept me engaged. And as I said, I didn't know what to expect with the book. I was just kind of it's about Bollywood, but we'll find out. And I've had some exposure to Bollywood, and there's some movies that I really do enjoy, but I'm not a massive Bollywood fan or anything. So reading it, at first I was like, oh, and then a lot of things made sense. So for argument's sake, you're probably more than aware of it, but the Mahabharata TV series they did back in the early 90s or whatever, that gripped the diaspora in a way that I've just never seen since. And I remember being, 9 or 10 or something, and my grandma's friend would record them on VHS and then lend them to my grandma. My grandma and I would then watch them I think the day after they would have come live. And then she'd pause it as we go through to explain to me what's happening. And I must have watched that TV series a million times, and I've taken something from it different every single time. And I've read versions and come away with different understandings. And then reading your book, I was like, oh, there's actually a whole theory and a philosophy and structure building and story building and so many kind of concepts and pieces of it made sense. And so I think what I really take from it is the beauty of the way you've blended your own story and what you're trying to relay about Bollywood. But I would love to find out what is in your journey, what is perhaps some of the most influential movies that kind of pushed you in this direction? Were there any in particular where you were like, this has made me fall in love with Bollywood, or this has made me really want to go and study this?
Well, everything. So it's really interesting because one of the things I talk about in the book is how when you grow up in India, as I did, you grow up with the movies and you know the movies before you ever see them. So I had heard the entire soundtrack of Mughal-e-Azam without ever watching it.
Oh,
So
I
we had
see.
these old LPs and it was full soundtrack of the entire film. I knew every dialogue, but I'd never seen the movie. Right. And they had all these photographs because, of course, it was in the LP. The album had the photographs, but it also, they were all over, magazines, etc., etc. So I filled in the blanks of what each scene would be like. So I kind of imagined the film before watching it. One of my absolute favorite songs, I think that was when I fell in love with music, was the Marodam from Hare Rama Hare Krishna. Now, I was a toddler. And I remember the first time, and we used to get together to watch, hear on radio, shortwave radio, this show called Binaka Geet Mala with Amin Siani. And the first time I heard it, that was it. I was like, this is it. This is magic. Now, I was too young to watch that film. And I didn't watch that film until sort of I was in my teens.
Yeah.
But it stayed with me. And, it's extraordinary how much those films matter. The other film would be American Brownie, because I actually watched that film as a kid and was, just it changed everything about how I think about films, about how I think about stories. It's curious because that same year, I also watched Parvarish, which is also a Desai movie. And I think that was like a big bonanza year for Desai. And I think to me, that was when I realized like you could tell stories. And I spent hours, days, making up stuff with these, what I now would know would be called storyboards. But I was a kid with like stick figures, like making these little squares and creating these charts. And then ripping them the pages and trying to mix and match and going, there's got to be a way. This is mystery. So definitely that. Gosh, so many. I think I'm always amazed by Diwar, which is a very 75. It's a very, very complex film. It's a very serious film, but it's got some great music. It's got a gorgeous Praveen Babi. So it's very glamorous, but it's a really powerful film about modernity, about modern India, about wider implications of choices we make. So Diwar would be very much it. But I think for me, Main Hoon Na was is really one of the extraordinary films. I always use, when I teach and people don't know anything about Indian cinema, I always start with Om Shanti Om. Because I think that, it's a modern, but perfectly crafted Manmohan Desai film. And it's a tribute pretty much, but I think he'd be happy because that's structurally as well crafted as, let's say, an American Antony is. But the one I use a lot is Ashoka. And it's not because I'm a Shah Rukh Khan fan necessarily, although I think he's such a towering figure, he doesn't need more fans.
Yeah.
But because that film is so wonderfully aesthetically crafted by someone who seems to instinctively get the logic of the rasas, the logic of structuring a film aesthetically, symbolically, technically, in this really deep-rooted way. And it's interesting because he's also trying to cover a philosophy, of Buddhism and the idea of, war versus, and all the sort of the depredations of it. And I just find that film absolutely stunning, despite the fact it's almost 25 years, because I think it's just so well crafted. I think there's a kind of, we're living through a moment when there not just Bollywood, but all of Indian cinema is in this churning moment of figuring out where to go next. But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out. There's a lot of attempts, but there's also kind of there's a real moment of renewal in creating things that kind of are rooted in a structure or rooted in a particular cultural ground, but have completely shifted into something else and are addressing modern concerns. But yeah, I could keep going. Also, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Zinat Aman, pretty much my entire wardrobe.
I was just, as we were talking, I was just Googling, because I think in our family, one of the classics, like, I was born in like the beginning of the 90s, so I grew up in, I probably butchered the pronunciation, but Sholle was a massive movie in our household.
Yeah.
And I just Googled it, and it was produced in 75, so it goes to show how much of a grip that had, and that's just one anecdote, right?
Yeah.
And equally, you mentioned Dum Wado Dum. Like, my mom was born in, she was actually born here, but she grew up in India because my granddad is Hindu Bengali Brahmin from Calcutta. They grew up in Bombay, and again, like, we grew up with Dum Wado Dum just like as a song in the background because my parents would listen to it, and it's just interesting then to hear how all of this actually goes back to Bollywood. And I just wouldn't have thought of that kind of long-reaching influence. One question, though, that I would love to get your insight on it, and you kind of alluded to it towards the end, which is, how has Bollywood or Indian cinema evolved or changed since independence, and more so kind of in the last couple of decades? Because India has certainly changed a lot in loads of other ways, and I guess how has that then influenced movie making?
So I think it's worth keeping in mind that when we think of culture, cultural shifts and cultural production is very much part of it. There's always a kind of back and forth. So there's going to be kind of quite conservative element that says, this is who we are, this is what we want to be. And then there is a kind of progressive moving forward impulse that says, look, maybe it needs to go the other way. I think post 47, there is a back and forth that happens. I think independence itself is a really interesting moment, because you would think that there is a moment where commercial cinema, especially Bombay cinema, takes time to celebrate and be enthusiastic and exult over independence. No, it doesn't happen. They just go from being critical and cynical about the Raj to going, this is not good. This is not what we needed, And then there's, of course, Raj Kapoor's got the material, all his work, which is around poverty and the rise, and the need for sort of policies. And he's very influenced in many ways by socialism, but also sort of has this link, is very keen on sort of elements of Italian realism, and has there's this incredible trip where they go off to Venice, and they meet with De Sica and then meet with Chaplin, and sort of they end up with this very kind of like, okay, how do we make socially engaged cinema? But at the same time, you've got Devanand, who is creating noir. And that's really, Indian noir comes out of that moment where that's why he plays these kind of small-time crooks. And, it's a kind of street-eye view of injustice and all that kind of the dark belly. But it's done with a very soft touch. So it's kind of, there's still romance, there's still sort of beautiful songs, but there's a really dark core. And, in some ways, Dilip Kumar walks a much more conservative line in terms of the narratives he takes on, and his star text is built based on that kind of fairly, quite mainstream, quite unchallenging, but deeply troubled, but also a tragic kind of element to it. The man who can't cope in some ways with the world that's happening. I mean, that's kind of the Devdas Dev Das is this, that, Dev Das is about a man the world is crumbling around
Yeah.
him and doesn't know where he fits. But I think that sort of is very much part of it. I always think it's very interesting that Guru Dutt is always seen as this kind of progressive director, and yet Mr. and Mrs. 55, which is a kind of comedy he makes quite early on, before his trilogy, the Great Tragic Trilogy, is actively, deeply patriarchal, and it's called 55 because that's the year that Hindu women got the right to divorce. And it's an entire, it's this kind of romantic comedy, if you want to call it that way, screed against the right to divorce and how it's going to destroy the family. It's really fascinating.
Wow.
So we don't really, we don't think that these people are going back and forth. And then I think when you go further, I think by the 60s, there's a real kind of hegemonic sense. So when you start looking, the Armed Forces Act, AFSBA, is already in place in various parts of the country. So the democracy is not really democratic already. And there is a kind of impulse of trying to make sense of the world. It's about sexual rights, it's about reproductive rights. So there's a lot of material, but there's also the sense of, my favorite part is this idea of, because the partition trauma is so vivid in that generation, that's really when you get the real big family split apart by fate and then somehow coming together to win over evil. And Waqt is one of them. And it's just, of course, it's Yash Chopra, that whole logic of, who is himself, I think, trying to make sense as somebody with Punjabi heritage of, what has happened. And I think that continues. In the 70s, you end up with, all the stuff that's around student unions, the strikes, the really, there's a lot of political cinema. You mentioned Sholay. There's two versions of Sholay, because Sholay comes out smack during the emergency, and they removed almost 15 minutes at the end, because it's sort of the final scene of Sholay is Dharmendra beating up Gabbar, and then sort of stopping to let the Thakur step in and beat him up, and then it stops because the cops come in. In the full cut, which I have on file, because I was like, it's very hard to find. It took me years to find it. The full cut actually has Thakur beating Gabbar to death. It's an extended, gory sequence.
Oh, wow.
And it's really something about the lack of the state and the lack of this kind of assertion of feudal power. It's a deeply problematic film when you see the full version.
And so they cut out that last bit because...
So they cut it out because the state asserts itself. And that's the starting part of, And of course, Emergency also censors a lot of other films. Kissa Kushika is... almost and is lost, and so on. But I think you have that constantly in there, and I think 80s again. You've got this kind of ongoing. For me, one of the most powerful films of the 90s is actually Matches. It's by Gulzar, and it's about and I think it does something which is necessary because it traces how the state creates people who then take up arms.
Yeah.
And so it's a really powerful examination of the state's role and state's injustices in creating the Punjab crisis, right? So I think so there is this constant stream. What I've been interested in is I honestly have to say, when I was writing the book, I thought I was writing kind of an elegy for Bollywood by saying, okay, a requiem, it's over. And then I had to actually stop and tell my publisher, go, stop, I'm changing the last bit. There might be hope still. And that was with Pathan, because I was in India, because I'd watched the sort of the rise of this exclusionary, patriarchal, sort of toxic masculinity, Islamophobic cinema over the last 10 years that, I mean, I have to say, I just kind of step away from. And I was watching the box office collections kind of dwindle. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, and it was like, okay, this kind of, it's done. And there were little shoots before, but then I was in India and Pathan happened. And I was sort of like, what, where, wait, this is very different.
Yeah.
And then it kind of happened back to back all through last year. And I'm really fascinated with that, because Pathan was the least explicitly political of the Shah Rukh Khan movies of the last year, the last three movies that he did back to back. Jawan was much more so. And then Dunki, with its focus on immigration and, you know, the issues around illegal immigration and the visa regimes, really was incredible. I was sort of like, okay, now you're kind of back and you're going to do this properly, which is nice.
I think what's interesting that you mentioned Donkey is it came on Netflix the other day, and as I said, I'm not really a massive Bollywood movie fan, and I ended up watching it, and I watched it through, like I watched it to the end, and I genuinely came away going, that is an amazing way of highlighting the positives and negatives involved, more so the negatives, but actually highlighting all those risks and those problems and interweaving it with the history. Like there's one scene where I don't know where they're at, and the lady that is with him turns around and he's like, I think he wants to go back at this point. They've left India, and she turns around and she's like, well, we're here because they were there. And again, like, I know it's just one scene, but in that one scene, she's talking about, I don't know how many hundreds years of history. Equally, you would, I think, sometimes have to be aware to get those connotations, but irregardless, it's such a well-constructed narrative and shows you kind of the emotional pulls in and out and the rest of it. But I have to ask you about that extended cut from Sholay, which is, did that ever then, so did that full cut ever actually get publicly released, or did it get kind of cut before it was shown?
I don't know if there was ever a moment where they released it fully, because normally the films have to go through the censor board, which is a kind of something that was constructed by the British and India, never got rid of. Kind of interesting. And so they would have, most likely would have censored it at that point.
Fine.
I found the cut in a collection of somebody who
I see.
Sort of held on to these, you know, who had been collecting these movies old school. And I'm not sure where he had. So he actually said, you know, I'll send you a DVD. So it's actually on a disc.
Oh my!
So
it's come from something else then, hasn't it?
So it's obviously come from something else. But when you watch it, it suddenly makes sense, because a lot of the stuff in that film, it's almost about 40 minutes longer than all the cuts I've seen normally.
Oh wow!
So there's a lot of stuff in there. I think some of that material was probably released, maybe not the final scene.
Yeah.
I think some of the stuff was included. There is also a really interesting scene in there with Thakur talking about, you know, Jaya's character, who's his daughter-in-law, and she's a widow, specifically talking about widow remarriage. So there's a lot of material in there that kind of gets cut out. And I think the way a lot of people have seen Sholay, which is very few people have, I mean, I've seen it in a kind of a festival scenario, much later, but very few of us have seen Sholay in a kind of formal, official way.
Yeah.
So we've seen them either on the old VHS, or we've seen them through those DVDs, often via Dubai. And I think the cuts depend on pretty much the person who was making them, or who was coming up with them. So I think that, and this full director's cut, for lack of a better word,
Yeah.
is very hard to find.
It makes sense because there are some parts of the movie where you kind of feel as though something isn't right or something's been missed out, and I guess that adds up if there's a true version somewhere, and they've obviously had to kind of reduce it down. That's fascinating all in its own right. One thing that really caught my attention in the book, and I know it's a random anecdote, which was the influence of Bollywood on hairdos and again, I may be pronouncing it wrong, but the sadhana cut. And the reason why I found that it's so interesting is because there's mothers of people that I know who still rock that hairdo. And I read it and I went, oh wow, it makes so, because we all kind of take the mick amongst ourselves and amongst my brothers, and we're like what is going on with the hairdo? But it makes sense now where it's come from. What other influential anecdotes did you discover during your research that you could share? Because that one, things just clicked.
Yeah, so the sadhana cut, I mean, Jennifer Aniston sort of got, preceded
Sidelined
by 30 years.
Yeah.
This is Sadhana cut. So Sadhana is an actress in the 60s. And so that's her, that very short fringe is very much her look. And it's quite interesting because there's a kind of, I've just blanked on the name of the movie. Is it Love in Shimla? Where it's one of her earliest movies, and she does a kind of My Fair Lady, kind of a chameleon-like transformation from the little mousy girl to with the hair like that, and then the modern girl, and that fringe kind of marks that. But Sadhana also sort of popularized the really tight churidar kameez, and which was huge. So I think all of our mothers probably wore it at some point if they were brave enough or if they were urban enough. But it's also things like the bikini. Sharmila Tagore. I think people forget this is the 60s. Sharmila Tagore showing up in a magazine in a bikini was transformative. Because here was for lack of a better word, a good girl from a really powerful background who was, from, very well linked as this glamorous actress. And she's willing to do that. And of course, the way she wore her saris, the skimpy blouses, the sort of all of that, right? So that's another moment. I would say Bachchan. Bachchan's big white flares, the whole logic of the top to toe white suit.
Yeah.
That's a really big one. It's kind of funny because I think I spent most of my childhood and 20s, 30s, even now probably, dressing like a combination of Zeenat Aman and Amitabh Bachchan. So I have the biker jacket in versions from Muqaddar Ghasiganda. I still have a version now. It's funny because I follow Zeenat Aman on Insta and everything, and I'm like, I owned that. She posted this thing, this sequin jacket. I was like, I bought one in New York when I was 16 because, but it's a constant. I mean, the chiffon saris with Sri Devi, the Chandni sari. But even if you think about any time, so I go to India at least once a year, and generally in the winter, which means it's kind of getting to the wedding season. And if you go into shops, you can directly link to what people will be wearing at their weddings, whether it's the brides or the bridesmaids or the grooms or the, anything. All the family, and what's been the big fashion moment. Always. But it's also little things that sort of, I keep thinking of Kareena Kapoor in soap, sort of 2000s, and that, and the various, movies she would, and her work would be, her wardrobe would make it into what is modern. But also, I mean, it's quite funny. If you go on Instagram, there are loads of videos of very, very young girls explaining how to recreate Kareena Kapoor's kajal makeup.
Yeah.
It's so embedded, and I think that's why it's worth thinking about how it's just like, it's so absolutely enmeshed, the films with the wider culture, fashion, music, art, all kinds of material. I mean, Salman Rushdie, people forget Satanic Verses. There's a whole Bollywood track that runs through because, it's about the Rekha Amitabh, rumors of the affair.
No, definitely.
People forget about that.
Yeah. One thing that was interesting reading the book was that Bollywood, and for argument's sake, engagements like Raj Kapoor and Nargis's promotional trips to Moscow, Bollywood is very much almost like a form of soft power for India during this period. How does that continue, and how is it changed, or how is it developed into what it's like nowadays? Because obviously Bollywood is far more internationally accepted. The diasporas have kind of solidified more, and whatever the words are, but as in there's far more of a kind of appetite as well, I guess. So how is that soft power developed?
So I think what is interesting for me about the Raj Kapoor Nargis engagement with the Soviet Union specifically, not just with Moscow, but just kind of traveling around, the joint productions, not just Mera Naam Joker, but there were lots of joint co-productions. There was this massive fandom. And in many ways that fandom continues in different spaces. But there were these organized trips. So it was very much about making sure that they were representing India in a way and talking about India. And that was a very kind of state-backed and supported logic. I think that continued for quite a while. Partly because I think it linked quite nicely with India's foreign policy. I think in the last 10 years or so, I think the Indian government doesn't actually know what to do with Bollywood.
Yeah.
And partly because it's not, art is not easily contained. And I think when you have high art, sort of, the opera kind of art, you can still work with it. But popular art and what it says and what it does and what it represents is not easily contained. And I think they're quite wary of it. So that isn't happening. And yet I think things have changed economically. We're in a very different space. I find it fascinating that Shah Rukh Khan seems to launch everything at Burj Khalifa. There's this mass, huge thing with, lit up, and there's this towering video projections. I mean, just madness. But he seems to launch there. I've also noticed this pattern where at least one of the songs of a major film is always released alongside in Arabic. So, Major Pathan has, so I find that, but then so did Fan and Jabra. And so there's a kind of pattern that there's a reaching out to the audiences.
How does that mend with then the increasing tendency, and I guess it's slightly veiled, but there's like an Islamic phobic kind of...
I don't think it's veiled at all. I think Islamophobia is shot through.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the stuff, things like Padmavat was grotesque. Sara Gadi, another, I think Akshay Kumar has made an entire career in the past 10 years of creating as hideously, how awfully toxic, masculine, Islamophobic representation can you come up with? So it's very much there. And I think this is what it's worth thinking about, that, when you've got an industry like that, it goes back and forth. It's not going to be every film. It's not like, you can't say that a whole batch of people making movies, it's like saying Hollywood, is somehow going to be one way or the other. There are wider, broad, you can do broad brushstrokes, and you can say, okay, that's a kind of progressive element, which tends to, and there's not, you can go back and forth. But I think it's, there has definitely been a rise of progressively, rise of really great films which are about sexuality, about gender, about class, about all kinds of things, and alongside this very, very deeply regressive streak. Large, big blockbusters, by definition, or we could even extend it, pretty much all cinema has to have, is by default, there's a conservative element to it, because unlike, just the budget's involved, right? So you're involving, you're going to have to convince somebody to put up the money. And we know where the money goes. And it's not going to be to the grand sort of hyper-progressive causes and representations and narratives. So I think that is already there, built into the system. But I think there is a kind of back and forth. I'm fascinated by the kind of renewal of the blockbusters. Trying to go down the progressive streak. I'm heartened by the fact that some of the more grotesque stuff, explicit stuff, seems to have bombed with the audiences, which I always kind of, it's not saying much, but I take a little bit of hope in that. So it's difficult one to kind of pin down. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the films that are ostensibly, huge, and, so one of those is RRR, which is not Bollywood. It's not Bombay. But RRR, got an Oscar, it was, everybody loves it. But I'm always fascinated how nobody's talking about the caste politics. Nobody's talking about the gender politics. Nobody's talking about the religious politics. For me, is this incredibly upper caste, straight cis man movie. And I can see why 12-year-old boys, it's kind of like Marvel version of for the 12-year-old boys. And it didn't work for me. I love the song. Yes, I think the song is beautifully well done. It's very, very fabulously, it's energetic, the beat's great, it's well shot. But the rest of the movie is deeply problematic.
No, fair enough. With your book, you aim to connect Bollywood fans, and these also people, I guess, like myself, who have an idea of what Bollywood is, and possibly create more for you. What do you hope readers, especially those new to Bollywood, take away from your book? Like, what is the kind of the key message you're trying to kind of get across?
Gosh, is there a key message? I think the key message is, look, try it. You'll enjoy it. This is fun. If you go in with an open mind and just the recognition that this is not playing to your understanding of what cinema is. This is a completely different language. Not just in terms of what is spoken, but just the way the story is told. It's a completely different architecture. It's a completely different language. Go in there, enjoy it. Read my book, because that'll probably help you figure it out.
Do read the book. It's a very good book.
Yeah, I've got the one with the proper cover.
Oh, yeah, I got the
You've got the proof.
Yeah,
You've got the proof. Yes, I've got the cover. But yeah, read it, because I think it will explain to you a lot more. It'll make sense to you more. And I think we enjoy things more when we understand what's going on.
Yes.
And I think Bollywood or any cinema is no different.
No, definitely. My last question is, after such an in-depth exploration of Bollywood and your own upbringing and life, what are the new projects or the next areas of cinema, or even just in general? Like, what are your next plans? Anything else? I know you mentioned you wanted to write another book, but it's easier said than done.
Yeah, so I have multiple hats. I write fiction. So my new novel, my novel Huddle Arcadia, is getting a new edition and comes out on Friday. This Friday on the 20th. Yeah, so this week. But also I write about cinema. I write about other things. So I am currently working on a novel, which is set in India. A sort of hopefully I'm in this version of style of telling the story of 1857 and what happened.
Oh, wow.
So that's a kind of a vast epic novel that I'm working on. Let's hope that it gets through. I can pull it together. Other than that, I think my dream project is a few years ago, I did a book on examining Amitabh Bachchan's stardom for BFI. And I had said to the editor that the book I want to write is not on Amitabh Bachchan. I want to write a book on Zinat Aman. So that project stays in the back of my head, that I will eventually write a book on Zinat Aman.
Yeah.
And then the project that I said earlier with Rifat that we had spoken about is a project on the impact, the political impact and influence of Bollywood in movements and countries across the world, and specifically around protests and protest movements and attempts at resisting power. So that's another project that just sits there. Eventually it will happen.
Nice. Well, I look forward to that, and I hope the writing comes together and everything works out. And definitely. But yeah, I just want to say I've had an absolute blast. We've spoken for just over an hour. I just wanted to double check. Is there anything that you think that we should include, or anything that we've missed out? Because I just would like to make sure we obviously cover everything.
Gosh, no, I think we're fine. I think
Brilliant.
we've had a far. It's always nice to kind of have an open-ended discussion, because you can just kind of float through rather than, pinpointing something.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. And this is why I enjoy it so much, because I get that opportunity to have conversations with people like yourself about these type of topics. So thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you.
And for answering this question so brilliantly. If you've made it all the way through this video, thank you. If you skipped to see what's coming up, well, you're in for a treat. Next week on Saturday, June 15th, we have an exciting episode of Sun Rises in the East, episode 6, a French TV series based on the Sikh Empire with added English subtitles by yours truly. Then the week after, on Saturday, June 22nd, join us for an in-depth discussion with Benjamin Siegel on his book Hungry Nation. We'll dive into the history of Indian agriculture, the Bengal famine, and the transformative Green Revolution. Mark your calendars and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out. Otherwise than that, see you next time.